Welcome back to the Faith and Ecology podcast, an initiative of the Jesuits for Climate Justice, Faith in Action at COP30 campaign. I am your host, Daniela, and we are almost a month out from the COP30. On this fifth episode of the podcast, we'll be speaking about food sovereignty, the right of communities to healthy, culturally appropriate food grown through sustainable agroecological practices. Our guests share powerful perspectives on sustainable rural development, access disparities, and frontline community support. They show us why reclaiming food sovereignty is urgent for protecting not only culture, health, and indigenous people's rights, but also to advancing climate justice that is rooted in the care for our common home. So let us jump right in. We have a superb lineup of guests for this episode, and joining us here now is Dr. Clara Nicholls. She is a Colombian agronomist with a PhD in entomology and biological pest control from UC Davis. She is a permanent professor at UC Berkeley, teaching sustainable rural development in Latin America, and lectures at several universities across Europe and the Americas. Clara is an honorary president of the Latin American Scientific Society of Agroecology and co-directs the Latin American Center for Agroecological Research. She focuses primarily on enhancing farm biodiversity to support natural pest control and designing agroecological solutions to improve climate resilience in agricultural systems. Thank you so much for joining us. Let's go right ahead with the first question. How would you explain food sovereignty to someone who is not familiar with the concept?
If we have to define food sovereignty, I think it's important to understand that it's a right to produce. It has to be with the access to national and local markets. So I think it's the first thing of food sovereignty, the right to produce. And the other thing is the right of farmers to have access to local markets, have access to land to produce, because all the credits and all the means to produce in the right way, and the knowledge about produce healthy food. So I think food sovereignty is a concept that implies more things than just access to food. So it implies education, it implies land reform, it implies markets, it implies credit, but the most important thing, the concept, the power to decide what kind of food and how they are going to produce.
What significance does food sovereignty have in achieving climate justice, especially on the road to COP30?
When we talk about climate change, it's very important to know not only the symptoms that we are facing right now, that is that the temperature is rising and all the aspects that present this event as a crisis. I think we need to understand what kind of food system, what are the root causes of this problem when we talk about food production. So the major root cause is the corporate control of the food system. That is mainly due to the agro-industrial food production that use a lot of a package of pesticide fertilizers, and they produce a lot of emissions. We need to help farmers to do the transition toward a system that can adapt to climate change, especially when we talk about farmers from the global south. And I think this concept comes from agroecology as a science. Agroecology provides all these elements to make the system more resilient to climate change. And because they use different kind of practices to reduce the emission, most of the agricultural practices capture carbon. That is very important in a scenario of climate change. And the other thing is that the farms can resist sometimes the most strong events that are coming. But if, for example, they just grow coffee in the slopes and they don't have any ground cover, so they are going to have this big problem. So this is the kind of practices that we are using in agroecology. So I think this have the concept of the right to decide that they are going to produce in an agroecological way, but at the same time, they are not producing emission, and also they have a diversity of products for the market. So you understand the concept of food sovereignty, and you say, okay, what is the scenario of climate change? You can understand that it goes together. So I think this is one way how we are going to overcome the problem. Not overcome, but at least to prepare for climate change. I want to add one thing that is very important when we talk about climate justice. I think it's very important to understand that there is a Berkeley, a the global north is producing all the emissions. So it's that they are the producers of climate change. And they're also receptors of climate change. And so there is an injustice here in this scenario. So if we are going to talk about climate justice, we need to touch or talk and take decisions on what are the root causes of the climate crisis.
Thank you so much, Clara. Now that you paint this very specific picture of food sovereignty in the context of our everyday lives and to the goal of achieving climate justice, let's move on to what this looks like in practice from the side of where we get our food from, farming communities and rural communities. And in order to really illustrate that impact, we have Dr. Christopher Bacon joining us. He is a professor and chair of Santa Clara University's Department of Environmental Studies and Sciences, where he leads community based research on agroecology, food sovereignty and security, and the political economy of systems change. Chris has published key work on diversified farming systems, agroecology, and studies analyzing how smallholder farmers and cooperatives navigate seasonal hunger and water insecurity in the context of the climate crisis and other hazards. His research focuses primarily on food and environmental justice in the state of California in the United States. Chris has co founded the Environmental Justice and Common Good Initiative, as well as the South Bay Food Justice Collaborative, serves on the editorial board of the Journal of Agroecology and Sustainable Food Systems, and co chairs the Association of Jesuit Colleges and Universities Laudato Si Commission.
Yeah, I've been working with smallholder farmers probably 25 years or so, and I've learned a ton from them and their organizations, their cultures, their organizing practices. I think what struck me early on is as important as the cultural and the identity-based dimensions of the food system change and articulating not only access to relevant foods that can be used in meaningful rituals and dietary practices, but also the basic needs dimension and the sustenance that goes along with it. It's the problem of seasonal hunger. And so this is often called a hidden form of hunger, and it's the most common form of hunger around the world. In Central America in particular, it's the months of June, July, and August, right? It's the period when the money from the commodity-oriented crops has run out because they might be harvested in December, January, and February. And then the new crops, if the rainy season starts in May or June, so they've planted the corn, they planted the beans, but they're not going to come in till August, September at the very earliest. And if there's a drought, that crop is going to fail. If there's a hurricane that comes through exacerbated climate change, that crop is going to fail. And so every year there are these periods, June, July, and August in Central America. It's different in parts of West Africa. It's different in other regions, even within the same country, depending on the climate, it can fluctuate. I think one of the most underappreciated dimensions of food sovereignty is the need to build food systems that end seasonal hunger once and for all. And we know it's possible.
In your opinion, what would be some of the key strategic moves in advocacy, but also in achieving this food sovereignty that we could do as people who accompany these processes in these vulnerable communities in our day to day work?
Well, why do people suffer through hunger and then attached to that, the food insecurities, lack of food sovereignty that's attached to it, right? It really comes down to a lack of political and economic power. And the problem is not that these folks are asking for a handout. They're just asking for somebody to take the foot off their neck. And in the case of decades of exclusion and unfair trade, not to the major businesses of the world, but to those that are least powerful. The problem is access, right? And access comes down to the ability of a household or an individual to secure healthy food every day. And so the challenge is to shift the terms where a household is able to access culturally relevant, healthy food during those seasonal periods of seasonal hunger, during those other periods. What could that look like in terms of advocacy campaigns leading up to COP30? Well, certainly one thing is canceling the debts for the poorest countries, right? Sometimes the interest rates that farmers are facing are 5 to 15% per month. And that interest rate is in part due to the national context in which many of the governments are heavily indebted. A second important component is strengthening the loss and damage fund, right? The losses and damage of climate change are paid for in the lives and livelihoods of smallholder farmers, rural workers, urban dwellers, all of us to some extent, even the middle class and the wealthy in different cities and different places around the world. So it needs to be operationalized not only at the global scale and the national commitments, but then articulated down through subnational governing bodies. And one of the most meaningful pieces of work that we're involved with right now is a collaborative of government agencies, like the public health department for the county of Santa Clara. And yet we're still see 20 to 30% of the population in this area is at risk of food insecurity. And so we have worked together to develop a collaborative, a South Bay Food Justice Collaborative that's looking to increase access to culturally relevant food for communities in these circumstances. And we've also seen what happened, during the pandemic when there were also wildfires and those cumulative hazards that are now impacting the global north as well as the global south, right? There's a lot we can learn in the United States from what's happening in places like Brazil and Mexico and other places around the world where they have successfully incorporated, for example, agroecology into a number of national and certainly regional policies. I think a lot of it comes down to people finding the inspiration to care for themselves and to realizing and also to care for each other and to care for for a common home. And it's the realization that folks can take, tangible individual actions, but also advocating. So that's just a little taste of, what they can do by working together and hearing the other people share their concerns and sharing their knowledge.
As we are in the middle of the Jubilee of Hope, I'd like to give you just an example to close this episode out with of what great hope can come from a region that is heavily impacted by the climate crisis. And here to illustrate that very resilient example of indigenous communities on the front lines with us is Elsa Pinto. She is a Timor-Leste project manager and community facilitator based in Dili. She works with the Jesuit Social Services in Timor-Leste, leading food security projects that support farmers and empower communities to create lasting change. She's passionate about uplifting local voices and draws on her deep connections with the Railako community to foster cooperation and resilience. With expertise in community development, gender equality, and peace building, Elsa holds a master's degree in international community development and peace and conflict studies. She is deeply committed to building a future where families and communities thrive through sustainable agricultural development. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. First of all, let me explain where am I located. So Timor is located in the Southeast Asia. We share half of the island with Indonesia. In terms of the population, we are only 1.3 million of people, where almost half of the population are below the age of 15, and 6% of our population is above 65 years of age. And we are now getting our independence quite recently in 2002 from a long war from the Portuguese colonialization and Indonesian occupation. So throughout this whole process, we lost a lot of our culture, practice, the way we connect to our land and our food, the water sources. We were banned. Our ancestors were banned to actually practice our culture. So now, since we're independence, I would like also to just share some of the statistic that we are now in the level of serious category of malnutrition. In the Global Hunger Index, Timor-Leste ranked 104 out of 107 in 2024. So this is very, very serious, where 46.7% of our children accounted for malnutrition, and child mortality is pretty high. These people are now struggling to survive, to have access to food and nutrition, to be able to have a dignified life. And with my work with the Jesuit Social Service in Timor, We work directly with the rural communities, targeting households and schools. So throughout this work, I could identify directly and also see it on daily basis that some of the key challenges that we're facing is we don't have a system in place from the national to rural community to or the other way around to actually work on the food system and food sovereignty. So food growing, seeds protection, water protection, soil conservation, we're doing it in a very small, locally lead, but at the national level, we have a lot of documents approved, but the implementation is still very difficult. And aside for that, as I already mentioned, our traditional knowledge and practices are lost. Now we're in the process of restoring it, but then with our 6% of the population, they have the knowledge. So the transfer of the knowledge and expertise, we have some problem in that. I will also say that the agriculture and food sector are in the agenda of the government, but not being seriously taken care of or implement. So if you imagine in the general state budget, the budget for agriculture, health, and education, you put together less than 10% budget allocated for these three sectors. And now we have climate vulnerability, high exposure to climate hazard, frequent crop failure because of changing weather. People cannot really tell when will be rainy season. And now as we speak, it's supposed to be dry season, but now it's raining. You couldn't even tell when is the best time to grow your crop, plant your crop. I think that's our challenges that we face.
As we approach a process like COP30, what message would you like to share about the role of food sovereignty in Timor?
I think for us Timorese, in food is our culture. It is part of our identity. So food sovereignty means a lot to us. To be independent means that you have control over your food, what you eat, if you can plan it or not. The whole idea of independence is not only as a country, but as a people, as a persons. And that's very much related to the food. So it means that we will be able to reduce or eradicate malnutrition, elevate our living standard of the people, and also to be resilient in this event of climate crisis. So for me, I appeal my message to the global community. You all need to agree on ways to better support indigenous community in realizing food sovereignty in their community. We talk about the community, not only stuck at the national level. Yeah, we talk about the community, the contact with the people, with the household, with the children at the community level. Because community, they have all the knowledge and the expertise. They know their land, they know their water sources, and they know the seeds. So give us the chance to reclaim our food sovereignty and be totally independent.
As our time together draws to a close for this episode, I'm taking away a lot of powerful lessons from our guests. Clara's emphasis on agroecological adaptation as a form of climate justice, Chris's urgent call for collective action centered on smallholder farmers and their rich cultural practices, and Elsa's powerful testimony of accompaniment of indigenous communities fighting for food security in Timor-Leste. It's very clear to me that food sovereignty is a global movement that touches each and every one of us. And to put it perfectly, I'll quote Indian climate activist Vandana Shiva, who reminds us food sovereignty is sovereignty over your life, livelihood, and health. We are interconnected. Therefore, food sovereignty is an ecological process of co creation with other life forms. So, thank you for tuning in and being a part of this important conversation. Don't forget to join us next week as we dive into agroecology, a term we heard a lot being used today, which is a beautiful blend of traditional wisdom and science that could really help us to grow towards a climate just future. Until then, stay curious and keep the conversation alive on the road to COP30.